Have you ever wondered what drives someone to adopt a dog with a rough past? What would it take to give a second chance to a dog that others might have given up on? For Jake, it was the idea of redemption, of giving a dog a better life. But did he know what he was really getting into? Jake had always dreamed of having a dog, but not just any dog. He wanted one with a history, a dog that had been through tough times, one that he could rescue and give a second chance. After months of searching, he finally found Rex, a Pit Bull Terrier, at a local shelter. The staff had warned Jake about Rex's troubled past, how he'd been neglected, abused, and left with scars both physical and emotional. But Jake saw something else in the dog's eyes. There was potential there, he believed. He could give Rex the love and care he deserved. But from the moment Rex entered Jake's home, something felt off. It wasn't obvious at first. It was more of a feeling, an undercurrent of unease. Rex, despite his docile appearance, carried an energy that was hard to ignore. His gaze, though calm at first, seemed to carry the weight of his past. It was as if the dog was constantly on edge, always aware of his surroundings, like he was expecting something to go wrong. And there were the little things. The way he would snap to attention at the slightest sound. The way his body tensed whenever someone moved too quickly around him. It was like Rex was constantly bracing for something bad to happen. Jake tried to brush it off. He was determined to make this work. He took Rex on long walks, played with him, and gave him a comfortable bed by the fire. But no matter how hard Jake tried to create a safe and loving environment, the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. Every day, it was clear that Rex had been through something terrible. And despite Jake's best efforts, it seemed like Rex's past was constantly lurking just beneath the surface. But Jake wouldn't give up. He was determined to prove that a dog like Rex could find peace, that his love could heal the wounds of the past. Yet, little did Jake know, the true challenge was just beginning. Have you ever felt that spark when you first connect with someone, even when they've been through the worst? Jake experienced that very moment with Rex, but it wasn't easy. The road to trust wasn't paved in an instant, and yet he found hope in every small step forward. For the first few days, Rex was distant, quiet, observant, and wary. His past had left deep scars, and Jake knew it would take time for Rex to heal. But Jake was determined to prove that love, patience, and care could change everything. Each morning, he'd kneel beside Rex, offering him a gentle hand and soft words, trying to bridge the gap that Rex's past had created. Rex would flinch at first, but slowly his body began to relax, responding to Jake's steady presence. Jake's patience paid off. Rex, once hesitant and aloof, started showing signs of trust. During their daily training sessions, Jake would work with him on simple commands. Sit, stay, come. At first, Rex seemed unsure, but there was a spark in his eyes, a flicker of curiosity. He would watch Jake intently, his ears twitching, his tail flicking slightly at the sound of praise. Jake's heart would swell with pride every time Rex obeyed a command. It was small victories, but they were victories nonetheless. Jake spent hours with Rex every day, building a routine that brought the dog comfort. He played tug-of-war with him, tossing a ball for Rex to chase, slowly seeing the dog's body language shift from stiff and fearful to relaxed and engaged. The bond they were forming was something Jake could almost feel in the air. Rex began to wag his tail more often, and his once distant gaze softened when Jake would speak to him. There were even moments when Rex would nudge Jake's hand, asking for attention, a clear sign that the dog was starting to trust him. For a while, it seemed like things were falling into place. Jake couldn't help but feel proud of the connection they were building. Rex, the dog with a troubled past, was responding to Jake's affection and care. The quiet, reserved dog he had once met at the shelter was slowly turning into the loyal companion Jake had always dreamed of. But even as he celebrated the progress, there was an unspoken feeling, an undercurrent of doubt, that Jake couldn't quite shake. The road ahead was still uncertain, and with each new breakthrough, a small voice in his mind whispered, "How long would this calm last?" Have you ever thought you knew someone or something so well, only for them to surprise you in a way that shakes your very confidence? Jake thought he had Rex under control, that they had a solid bond and everything was falling into place. But that one evening, everything changed. Jake had invited his friend Mark over, wanting to share his new companion and show off how well Rex had been doing. They'd spent months getting to know each other, and Jake was proud of the progress they'd made together. He believed that Rex was finally settling into his new life, starting to heal from the wounds of his past. The dog had shown a willingness to trust, and Jake had grown to believe that the worst was behind them. But the evening took a sharp turn when Mark stepped through the door. The moment Mark entered, something shifted in Rex. It was subtle at first, a slight tensing of his muscles, the fur along his back standing on end, but it quickly escalated. Rex's eyes, which had softened over the past few weeks, became sharp and alert. His ears flattened against his head, and before Jake could process what was happening, Rex let out a low growl. The sound sent a shiver down Jake's spine. It wasn't the playful growl Rex would give when he was excited to play. This was something different. It was deep, primal, filled with warning. Jake froze, unsure of what to do. "Rex, stop," he said, trying to use the command he'd taught him, but Rex didn't listen. The growling deepened, and Rex started snapping at the air as if to ward Mark off. His tail, once relaxed and wagging in Jake's presence, now stood rigid, stiff as a board. Jake's heart raced. This wasn't the dog he had been bonding with. This wasn't the dog that had made him feel safe. Mark, too, was caught off guard. He took a step back, his face showing clear concern. "Jake, maybe I should leave," he said, his voice laced with unease. But Jake wasn't ready to give up. He had worked so hard, and the idea that something could go wrong now felt impossible. "It's just a reaction," Jake reassured himself, though doubt gnawed at him. He stepped toward Rex slowly, trying to calm him, but Rex only intensified his stance, growling louder. Jake's mind raced. Was it fear? Was it territorial aggression? Jake didn't know, but he couldn't help but feel a cold knot forming in his stomach. Was this just a one-time reaction, or was something deeper happening? Have you ever felt that sinking feeling when things you thought were improving suddenly start slipping away? Jake certainly did. What began as small signs of discomfort and agitation in Rex slowly escalated into something far more concerning. The little setbacks, which Jake had hoped were just isolated incidents, began to weave themselves into a pattern that was harder to ignore. Rex's behavior, once mild and manageable, started to change. It wasn't just a momentary snap at the new friend. It was now something deeper, more consistent. Whenever Jake would take Rex out for walks, Rex would growl at other dogs, his posture tense, his hackles raised. It wasn't just a casual, defensive growl either. It was an aggressive rumble that made Jake's heart race. Rex's eyes would narrow, and his body would stiffen, his focus entirely on the other dogs, as if he saw them as a threat to his territory. The more Jake tried to gently pull Rex away, the harder it became. Rex pulled against the leash, desperate to confront anyone who crossed his path. But it wasn't just other dogs. The aggression extended to strangers as well. The once calm dog, who had bonded with Jake through months of training, began to growl when anyone approached too quickly or too closely. A friend of Jake's stopped by one evening, and Rex immediately went into a defensive stance. The growling started low, but as the friend stepped closer, Rex's body language became more intense, his teeth visible as he snapped once, then twice. Jake, feeling the tension in the air, tried to intervene but found himself caught off guard. He wasn't prepared for this. Rex wasn't just a dog anymore. He was becoming something that made Jake question his ability to control the situation. Every interaction with Rex now felt uncertain, like walking on a tightrope. The dog's aggressive tendencies were growing, but Jake didn't want to give up. He spent more time with Rex, trying to soothe him, trying to teach him that not everyone was a threat. But no matter what Jake did, gentle reassurances, training sessions, or extra exercise, Rex's behavior seemed to worsen. Jake's mind raced with worry. Was Rex always going to be this way? Was there something he missed, some deeper issue that he wasn't seeing? But Jake clung to hope, telling himself that with more time, more patience, and continued training, things would get better. But deep down, he couldn't help but wonder if it was already too late. Would the love and effort he'd put into Rex ever be enough to undo the damage of the past? Have you ever been warned about something, yet dismissed the signs because you just didn't want to believe it? That was Jake's reality. He knew Rex's past had been difficult, and he was trying so hard to make their relationship work. But with each warning sign, Jake felt a pull to ignore it, convincing himself it was just a phase. After all, Rex had made so much progress. So when things started to shift, when Rex began growling at him during playtime, Jake brushed it off, telling himself it was just a quirk of the dog's personality. It started innocently enough. Rex, during their daily play sessions, would growl at Jake, not a loud, threatening growl, but a soft, low rumble, especially when toys or food were involved. At first, Jake thought it was just Rex trying to get attention, or maybe a part of his playful nature. The growl didn't seem too alarming, and after all, dogs sometimes growl when they're excited, right? But then it happened more frequently. Rex began to growl when Jake tried to take a toy away, or even when Jake reached for his food bowl. The first few times, Jake told himself it was nothing, just Rex being a little possessive, just the dog acting out of excitement. But as the growls became louder and more frequent, Jake started to feel a deep, gnawing unease in the pit of his stomach. Still, he ignored it. "He's just playing," Jake would say to himself. "It's not a big deal." But it was a big deal. Deep down, Jake knew that something wasn't right, but he didn't want to admit it. He didn't want to believe that Rex, the dog he had brought home to offer a better life, could be a danger. So instead of addressing the problem, Jake pushed it aside, telling himself that more training and time would fix it. After all, they had made so much progress. Rex was a good dog, right? The truth, though, was that every growl was a red flag. Rex's behavior wasn't just playful, it was possessive, territorial, and increasingly aggressive. But Jake's desire to believe in a happy ending, to make this work no matter what, kept him from seeing the warning signs for what they truly were. And as each day passed, the tension between him and Rex continued to grow, quietly simmering under the surface, until it would eventually boil over. Have you ever been so protective of something, so invested in its well-being, that you convinced yourself it was okay, even when everyone else saw the warning signs? Jake found himself in that very position. Despite the growing tension between him and Rex, Jake's protective instinct kicked in. Everyone around him, friends, family, even Mark, started noticing Rex's aggression. They'd offer advice, suggesting that Jake take stronger action, but Jake couldn't hear them. To him, Rex wasn't just a dog with behavioral issues. He was a living being with a past that needed understanding. Jake believed that with patience, Rex could overcome his aggression. The dog's past had been full of hardship, and Jake wasn't going to give up on him just because he had some issues to work through. It started with small things. Jake would snap at people who pointed out Rex's aggression. "He's just scared," Jake would say, brushing off the concern in a defensive tone. "He's had a hard life. He just needs time." But deep down, Jake knew that something wasn't quite right. Rex's behavior was becoming less of an isolated incident and more of a pattern. It wasn't just the growling at strangers now, it was the way he would stiffen when someone came near Jake, as if warning them away. Rex started lunging at anyone who got too close, snapping and showing his teeth, and Jake began to feel a sense of unease that he couldn't push away anymore. Still, Jake refused to acknowledge the severity of the situation. He rationalized it by telling himself that it was Rex's past influencing his behavior. He believed that with enough time and understanding, Rex would settle down. But as time passed, Rex's aggression only grew stronger. He wasn't just growling anymore. He was actively challenging people who came into Jake's space, barking, snapping, and trying to assert dominance. The dog Jake had once considered a companion was now a source of constant tension. And Jake couldn't bring himself to admit that maybe, just maybe, he was enabling it. Jake grew more isolated, more protective. He pushed away anyone who didn't understand what Rex had been through. He couldn't see how things were spiraling out of control because he was too wrapped up in the idea that love and understanding were all it would take to make Rex right again. But deep down, Jake was beginning to sense a shift that felt like it was getting harder to control, and one that he wasn't prepared to face. Have you ever thought you knew a situation so well, only for it to suddenly turn on you in a way you didn't expect? Jake had been working so hard, investing all his patience and care into Rex. But when Rex bit him, it wasn't just a physical wound. It was a blow to Jake's confidence in their bond. It was a typical day. Jake had just finished a training session with Rex, and he thought it was time for a bit of play. Rex had a toy that Jake had been trying to remove for a while. Nothing too unusual, just a tug-of-war game that had become a part of their routine. Rex, however, had other ideas. He held onto the toy tightly, not letting go, and when Jake gently tried to take it from him, something shifted in the dog. Jake's movements were slow and deliberate, trying to avoid triggering any response, but Rex's eyes hardened. The playful growl that Jake had grown accustomed to suddenly became more threatening, a low rumble that vibrated through the air. Before Jake could pull his hand back, Rex snapped, biting down on his arm with surprising force. It wasn't a deep bite, but it stung sharply, the pressure making Jake's skin flare with pain. Jake recoiled in shock, pulling his arm away quickly. The bite wasn't severe, but it was enough to send a wave of alarm through Jake. He looked down at the small wound on his arm, the blood barely visible, but the sting intense. His mind raced, his heart pounded. How had it come to this? Rex, the dog he had spent months trying to connect with, had bitten him. Despite the pain, Jake was rattled but not defeated. He knew that Rex's past had shaped him, that there was still hope for the dog. He convinced himself that this wasn't the breaking point, that Rex could still change. The bond they had built wasn't broken by one act of aggression, he thought. But deep down, Jake couldn't help but feel a gnawing unease. Was this bite just a fluke, or was it a sign of something deeper? And as the days passed, Jake continued to wrestle with the same question. Can Rex really be helped? Have you ever been in a situation where you tried so hard to make something work, only to feel that nagging doubt creeping in, making you question your every move? Jake had reached that point with Rex. Every day, the small signs of Rex's aggression seemed to grow more pronounced, and it was becoming impossible for Jake to ignore them. But still, Jake wasn't ready to give up. He couldn't be. The first few weeks had been full of progress, and the bond they'd shared had been undeniable. Rex, despite his troubled past, had responded to Jake's patience and care. But now, with each passing day, Jake began to feel a shift. He had always trusted Rex, but as the dog's behavior became more unpredictable, Jake found himself second-guessing every interaction. He would reach down to pet Rex, but hesitate, wondering if this would be the moment Rex would snap. When they played, there was a part of Jake that braced himself for the growl, the sudden aggression. And when Rex growled during feeding time, Jake couldn't help but tense up, unsure of what would come next. Jake's instincts began to shift from affection to caution. He would approach Rex more carefully, always watching the dog's movements. His eyes would flick to the dog's posture, checking for any signs of aggression. But despite his growing unease, Jake wasn't ready to throw in the towel. He had promised himself he would give Rex a better life, and giving up now would mean he had failed. So he pushed the doubt aside. It's just a phase, Jake would tell himself. He's been through a lot. He just needs time. But every time Rex's eyes narrowed or his growl rumbled in his throat, Jake's confidence in the dog began to fade just a little more. Still, Jake refused to admit defeat. He continued with the training, spent more time with Rex, always hopeful that with enough love and patience, the dog could be turned around. But with each passing day, it was becoming harder for Jake to ignore the feeling that things were slipping out of his control. Rex was changing, and Jake wasn't sure he could stop it. Would his determination be enough to save the bond they had, or was it already too late? Have you ever had that feeling when everything you've worked so hard for suddenly starts slipping through your fingers, but you tried desperately to convince yourself it's just a phase? Jake felt that way one evening as he watched Rex. For the past few weeks, the signs of aggression had been building, but Jake had managed to push them aside, convincing himself that it was just the dog adjusting, just Rex's past coming through in spurts. But tonight, it was different. Tonight, there was no denying that something was changing in the dog. Rex, who had once been calm and docile, was now reacting violently to even the smallest movements. It started when Jake reached for the TV remote across the couch. A quick, innocent movement, but Rex's eyes locked onto him instantly, his body stiffening. His tail, usually relaxed, was now low, almost rigid, and his ears were pressed flat against his head. The low growl that followed was barely audible at first, but it made Jake freeze in place. His pulse quickened. Rex had never reacted like this before, and the tension in the air was palpable. It wasn't just a response to a sudden movement. It was a deep, defensive reaction. Jake tried to brush it off, shaking it off as just a one-off moment. But it wasn't just that. The next time Jake reached down to pick up his cup, Rex's eyes followed him with an intensity that sent a chill down Jake's spine. Rex was watching, tracking every movement Jake made with an unsettling focus. Jake slowly stood up to walk across the room, and Rex stood, his body tight and rigid, ready to react. Every time Jake moved, Rex reacted, his body becoming a tense, coiled spring. Jake could feel the unease creeping up his spine. This wasn't normal. His mind raced, but he tried to push it down, telling himself it was just Rex being protective, just Rex adjusting. But deep down, Jake knew it was more than that. The behavior was escalating, and Jake was beginning to realize that no matter how much love and care he had poured into this dog, Rex's past was influencing everything. And it was no longer just the past. This was something that was now happening in the present, in front of him. Jake forced a smile, trying to calm his own nerves. "It's okay, Rex. It's just me," he murmured. But even as he said it, the words felt hollow. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where everything you thought you knew about someone, or in this case, a dog, suddenly turns upside down? Jake had always thought that with enough patience and love, he could help Rex heal from his troubled past. But this particular evening, as Rex's aggression over food escalated, Jake realized just how wrong he might have been. It started like any other mealtime. Jake set Rex's food bowl down in the kitchen, and the dog, eager and hungry, rushed over to devour it. But tonight something was different. As Jake walked by to check on Rex, the dog suddenly snapped. It wasn't just a growl or a warning bark, it was a sharp, quick motion, with Rex's teeth coming dangerously close to Jake's hand. The suddenness of it took Jake by surprise. Rex had always been responsive to commands before. He'd learned to wait for his food, to sit, to stay, but tonight, there was no sign of the docile dog Jake had come to know. Jake's heart raced as the tension in the air thickened. His instincts screamed at him to pull away, but he didn't. He couldn't. He had worked too hard to let this slip. This was his moment to assert control, to remind Rex that he was in charge. With a deep breath, Jake knelt down, trying to keep his voice steady as he gave the command. "No, Rex, leave it." But instead of listening, Rex's eyes locked onto Jake with an intensity that Jake had never seen before. His body tensed, his lips curled back in a snarl, and for a brief moment, the dog seemed to challenge Jake's authority. Jake could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, his hands trembling slightly as he maintained eye contact with Rex. There was no hesitation now. The dog was no longer showing the signs of submission Jake had grown used to. Instead, Rex's eyes were filled with fury. He was no longer the dog Jake had saved from the shelter. He was someone else entirely, someone full of raw, untamed aggression. Jake struggled to maintain his composure, his voice shaking as he tried to assert himself again. "Drop it, Rex." But Rex wasn't backing down. His growl deepened, vibrating through the floor, and Jake's mind spun. What was happening? Was this the dog Jake had been working so hard to trust, or was he losing control? The confrontation was escalating, and Jake knew this moment would define everything. But even as fear clawed at his chest, he couldn't bring himself to walk away. Could Rex still be saved, or was it too late? Have you ever worked tirelessly to help someone, only for them to betray your trust in the most shocking way? Jake had dedicated so much of himself to Rex. He had given the dog his time, his patience, and his love. But now, as the tension between them escalated, Jake found himself facing something far worse than anything he could have imagined. It was the moment he'd hoped would never come, but he couldn't avoid it any longer. It started with a small disagreement over a toy. Jake, still trying to assert control over Rex's growing aggression, tried to take a chew toy away from him. It wasn't unusual for Rex to get possessive, but tonight, Jake felt the tension in the air thickening. Rex's growl was deeper, louder, and more menacing than ever before. His body was rigid, his teeth bared, as if daring Jake to move any closer. Jake, feeling the familiar pang of unease, hesitated for a moment. But he couldn't back down now, not after everything he'd put into this. He needed to show Rex that he was still in charge. With a deep breath, Jake reached down again, trying to calmly take the toy from the dog's mouth. But this time, it was different. Rex lunged forward, his mouth snapping shut just inches from Jake's hand. Jake recoiled, his heart racing, but Rex wasn't done. In one swift motion, the dog attacked. Rex's massive body slammed into Jake, knocking him to the floor with an overwhelming force. Jake hit the ground hard, his breath knocked out of him, his head spinning. The shock of it hit him like a wave, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. Rex stood over him, growling, eyes full of fury. Jake's chest tightened as fear surged through him. This wasn't the dog he had been bonding with, the dog he had spent so much time saving. This wasn't the dog he had lovingly cared for. It was as if something in Rex had snapped, and Jake was left struggling on the ground, unsure of how to regain control. His thoughts were a blur, his heart racing as he stared at the dog, unable to believe that Rex, the very dog he had worked so hard to save, could turn on him like this. Jake's mind was in turmoil. Was it his fault? Had he misjudged the situation from the start? Or was Rex just beyond saving? The world around him seemed to freeze, and in that moment, Jake realized how little control he truly had. Have you ever felt completely out of control in a situation where everything you tried to do just made things worse? Jake's mind was racing, his heart pounding in his chest as he lay on the floor, struggling to keep Rex at bay. Every instinct in his body screamed for him to act, to do something, anything, but nothing seemed to work. Rex, once the dog he had tried so hard to save, had turned into a force of pure aggression. Rex's growl was deep and guttural, the sound vibrating through Jake's bones as the dog bared his teeth. The fury in Rex's eyes was unmistakable. It was as though all the progress they had made, all the trust Jake had worked to build, had evaporated in an instant. Jake's pulse quickened, and the room, which had once felt like a place of safety, now felt suffocating. The air was thick with tension, the chaotic growls and sounds of struggle echoing in every corner. Jake was trying to regain control, his mind searching for a way to calm the situation, but Rex's fury seemed unstoppable. Jake pushed against Rex, his hands shaking as he tried to keep the dog at a distance. The dog, much stronger than Jake had anticipated, easily overpowered him. Every time Jake tried to rise or shift, Rex lunged, knocking him back down. The more Jake struggled, the more intense Rex's growls became. His teeth, gleaming white in the dim light, flashed dangerously close to Jake's face as the dog snapped, trying to assert dominance. Jake's mind spun. Was this it? Had he failed? Was this the end of everything he had hoped for with Rex? The dog he had rescued, the dog he had worked so hard to love and train, was now a creature of pure rage. Jake's emotions were a whirlwind: fear, regret, confusion. Why hadn't he seen this coming? What had gone wrong? The room seemed to close in on Jake. He was trapped, both physically and emotionally, as Rex's aggression overwhelmed him. His heart raced, his breath coming in short gasps, but in the chaos of the moment, Jake refused to give up. He had to keep fighting for control, but with every second that passed, it seemed more and more impossible. Was Rex beyond saving? Would Jake be able to restore the trust they once had? Or was this the moment that shattered their bond forever? Have you ever had a moment when everything you thought you understood suddenly shatters, leaving you overwhelmed and unsure of what to do next? That's exactly what Jake was feeling in the heat of the moment. As Rex's aggression surged, Jake couldn't grasp how things had spiraled so quickly. The dog he had rescued, the dog he had trained and loved, had turned on him in a way he never saw coming. Rex, the dog he believed he could trust, had become a force of terror. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he lay on the floor, struggling to push Rex away, but the dog's fury was overwhelming. Rex wasn't just being defensive or protective. He was vicious, his body tense with rage, eyes filled with an anger Jake had never seen before. Every time Jake tried to move or get up, Rex lunged at him, biting and snarling. Jake's mind raced, his thoughts tumbling over one another. How had it come to this? Why hadn't he seen the warning signs sooner? He had tried so hard to give Rex a better life, to show him love and patience. But now, in the midst of this attack, all of Jake's efforts seemed meaningless. His emotions swirled, fear gripping his chest, regret gnawing at his insides, and guilt that threatened to suffocate him. The confusion was unbearable. How could the dog he had brought home to heal, the dog he had envisioned as a loyal companion, be the one to cause him this pain? The memories of their happy moments together, the long walks, the quiet evenings on the couch, the training sessions that had once brought them closer, faded in the face of Rex's rage. All of those moments seemed like lies now. Jake's mind couldn't process it. Every movement from Rex felt like a betrayal, each snap of the dog's teeth making Jake question everything he thought he knew about their relationship. In that moment, Jake realized how powerless he was. He had been so sure that his love and care would be enough, but now, as Rex stood over him, full of aggression, Jake could only feel one thing: fear. The dog he had worked so hard to save was no longer the companion he had hoped for, and as Jake fought to keep control of the situation, the weight of his failure sank in. Had he made a mistake? Was Rex beyond saving? Could he ever regain the bond they once shared? Have you ever found yourself fighting for control, only to feel that everything is slipping away with each passing second? Jake was living that moment, his heart racing, his body bruised and aching from the violent clash with Rex. The dog he had once trusted had become a nightmare, and Jake was now in the fight of his life. As Rex lunged at him once again, Jake's survival instincts kicked in. The sheer panic and desperation surged through his veins, and with a burst of adrenaline, he managed to push Rex off of him. It was a struggle, his hands shaking, his body aching from the impact of the attack, but Jake managed to scramble to his feet, staggering as he tried to steady himself. Every movement felt like it took everything out of him. His head spun, his breath ragged from the fear and the exertion. Jake's mind was in chaos. He couldn't believe what was happening. The dog he had been so determined to save was now a threat to his very safety. As Rex paced back and forth, growling, Jake's thoughts raced. Was this it? Was Rex lost to the aggression he had worked so hard to undo? Would he ever be able to regain the control he once had? His body was bruised, his shirt torn, his arm throbbing from the earlier bite. Jake was shaking, fear creeping into his every move. He knew he couldn't handle Rex on his own anymore. He couldn't risk the dog's unpredictable aggression. Desperate, Jake reached for his phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed the number. But when he tried to speak, his voice was barely a whisper, hoarse and strained from the terror and the struggle. He could barely form the words. He had never felt more vulnerable in his life. "Help! Please! Help me!" Jake managed to gasp, the fear in his voice making the words sound foreign to him. He had always been strong, always the one who took charge. But now, as he faced Rex's unrelenting fury, Jake was powerless. His world, once full of hope and possibilities, had been shattered in an instant. All he could do was wait, his body trembling, as the desperate call for help echoed in the silence around him. Would help arrive in time? Would Rex's aggression be too much to overcome? Have you ever had that gut-wrenching realization that everything you hoped for, everything you worked toward, might not come to fruition? Jake was experiencing that exact feeling, and it hit him like a ton of bricks. The adrenaline that had once fueled him had started to drain, replaced by a quiet, cold truth that was becoming impossible to ignore. Rex, the dog he had tried so hard to help, was no longer the companion Jake had envisioned. As Rex circled him, his low, menacing snarl filling the air, Jake could see the dog's fury reflected in every movement. The once loyal companion, the dog he had saved, had become a creature of aggression and unpredictability. Every step Rex took was calculated, as if he was looking for an opening to strike. Jake's breath was shallow, his body tense, every muscle screaming for him to move, to act. But something had shifted within him. The urgency he had once felt to protect and save Rex was now clouded by doubt. For the first time, Jake saw Rex for what he truly was in that moment, a force of anger, an animal that couldn't be tamed by love alone. The love Jake had poured into the dog, the time spent training him, the hope of creating a bond, none of it had been enough to suppress the deep-rooted aggression inside Rex. His eyes, once soft and trusting, now held only rage, and the fear in Jake's chest told him everything he needed to know. No matter how hard he had tried, Rex might never be the companion he had dreamed of. The realization hit Jake's heart like a hammer. He wasn't sure when it had happened, but he now knew that Rex wasn't just a victim of his past. He was a danger to Jake and to anyone else who crossed his path. And for the first time, Jake had to face the bitter truth. He might need to let Rex go, for the safety of everyone involved. The thought of giving up on Rex, the dog he had tried so hard to help, broke Jake's heart. It wasn't just a decision, it was a crushing weight on his soul. But as Rex continued to snarl, circling Jake with every intention of lashing out, Jake knew it was the only option left. His chest tightened as he came to terms with the inevitable. Would he be able to walk away, knowing that he couldn't save Rex, no matter how much he loved him? Have you ever had to make a decision that shattered your heart, but you knew it was the only choice left? That's where Jake found himself now. He had spent so much time, so much energy trying to save Rex. He had believed that with enough patience and care, the dog could overcome his past and be the loyal companion he dreamed of. But as Rex's aggression continued to escalate, Jake realized he was no longer in control. The dog he had worked so hard to help had become a danger, not just to him, but to anyone around him. And Jake knew deep down that he couldn't let it go on any longer. With shaking hands, Jake picked up his phone. The decision felt like a crushing weight pressing down on him. He dialed the number for animal control, his mind racing with guilt, his body trembling with the magnitude of what he was about to do. His voice cracked as he spoke, barely audible. "I need help. My dog. He's becoming dangerous. I can't keep him anymore." The words felt like an unbearable betrayal. Every fiber of his being wanted to hold on, to keep fighting for Rex, but the reality was clear. Rex was no longer the dog Jake had rescued. He was a threat to his safety and to the safety of anyone who came near. The animal control officer on the other end was calm, understanding, but Jake could barely hear them over the pounding in his ears, the deep ache in his chest. Rex had been his project, his responsibility. How could he let go now? But he knew he had no other choice. It was no longer about giving Rex a second chance. It was about protecting everyone involved, including the dog himself. Within hours, animal control arrived. The heaviness in Jake's heart grew with each passing minute. As Rex was led away, Jake watched, his heart breaking. The dog he had spent months building a bond with, the dog he had promised to save, was now being taken from him. Jake's chest tightened with sorrow as he closed the door behind him, knowing that he would never see Rex again. The house felt empty. The space that had once been filled with hope and love now felt cold, the absence of Rex's presence a painful reminder of the loss. In that moment, Jake couldn't help but wonder if he had failed. Had he been too late to recognize the signs? Had he done enough to save Rex, or had his efforts been in vain? The questions gnawed at him as the silence of the house surrounded him, and all Jake could do was sit with the pain of letting go. Have you ever questioned your choices, wondering where things went wrong despite your best intentions? That's where Jake found himself now, lost in a sea of doubt, regret, and emotional turmoil. After Rex was taken away, the house felt eerily silent, and Jake was left with nothing but the heavy weight of what had just happened. Every moment, every memory of Rex seemed to replay in his mind. He thought back to the first day he brought the dog home, full of hope, convinced that he could make a difference. How had it all unraveled so quickly? The bond Jake thought he had built with Rex, the long walks, the late-night training sessions, the quiet moments on the couch, now felt like an illusion. He had tried so hard to save the dog, to be the owner Rex needed, but none of it seemed to matter. The love, the patience, the endless hours spent trying to undo the damage of Rex's past, all of it had crumbled in a matter of moments. Jake couldn't help but wonder where he went wrong. Was it his fault? Had he ignored the signs of aggression too long? Was there something he missed in Rex's behavior that could have prevented this from happening? The questions swirled in Jake's mind, each one more painful than the last. The guilt gnawed at him. Had he done enough for Rex? Was there a way he could have saved him, or was Rex's aggression just too deep-rooted to overcome? These thoughts plagued Jake, and with each passing day, they only grew louder. The weight of the decision to call animal control felt like 1,000 pounds pressing down on his chest. Even though he knew it was the right choice for his safety and the safety of others, the guilt of letting Rex go haunted him. As Jake tried to heal, he found it impossible to move on from the pain of what had happened. Every corner of the house seemed to remind him of Rex. Every toy, every bed, every corner that once felt full of life now felt hollow. How could he move forward when the bond he thought he had was shattered beyond repair? Jake had always believed in second chances, but this time it felt like he had failed. The emotional weight of the loss was more than Jake could bear, and he was left to question the true cost of love, trust, and the decisions we make for the ones we care about. Have you ever experienced the profound silence after someone has been taken away? The absence of that presence can feel deafening, as if the walls are closing in and every corner of the space echoes with the memories of what was once there. Jake was living that reality now. The house, which had once been filled with the sounds of Rex's playful barking, the shuffling of paws, and the quiet companionship they shared, now felt hollow. The silence was overwhelming, consuming every room, every moment, as Jake tried to adjust to a life without the dog he had fought so hard to save. The weight of regret sat heavy on Jake's chest. He had tried everything. He had given Rex love, patience, and all the care he could offer. But in the end, it wasn't enough. Rex had become a danger, and Jake had made the agonizing decision to let him go. Now, in the silence of his home, Jake's mind constantly replayed the moments leading up to that decision, asking himself, what could I have done differently? The loneliness crept in quickly. He would walk through the empty rooms, expecting to see Rex lying on his bed or pacing by the door, waiting for their next walk. But all he was left with was the quiet reminder that Rex was gone. No more wagging tail, no more eager eyes following Jake around the house. Just silence. And with that silence came the harsh reality of Jake's decision. The emptiness of the house reflected the emptiness Jake felt inside. He missed Rex's presence so much that it physically hurt. But at the same time, Jake knew he couldn't keep living in a situation where the threat of aggression was constantly looming. The loneliness grew as the days passed, and Jake found himself withdrawing. He avoided friends who had offered their advice, keeping the pain and guilt locked inside. What could he say? How could he explain that, despite his best efforts, he had failed? The loss wasn't just of the dog, it was the loss of the bond Jake had hoped for, the loss of something he thought could be salvaged. Jake's world had changed forever. He had let go of Rex, but now he had to face the fact that he would have to heal without him. Would he ever find peace? Would he ever feel whole again? The silence in the house screamed at him, and all Jake could do was sit with it, reflecting on everything he had tried to do and everything he had lost. Have you ever faced something so painful that you couldn't change, but knew you had to learn from it in order to heal? That's where Jake found himself. The silence that had filled his home after Rex was taken away lingered in his heart for what felt like forever. He had made the difficult choice to let go of the dog he had worked so hard to save, but it was a decision that left him riddled with guilt. Every corner of the house reminded him of what he had lost. But Jake wasn't someone who gave up, and slowly he began to understand that the pain he felt could become a lesson, not just a burden. Time passed, and as the days stretched into weeks, Jake started to take steps toward understanding the complexities of Rex's aggression. He began to seek answers, not just to heal himself, but to understand the behavior he had struggled with. Jake enrolled in therapy sessions not only for his own mental health, but also to gain a deeper understanding of the behavioral issues Rex had faced. Through these sessions, Jake learned more about the psychological trauma that could be carried by dogs, especially those with troubled pasts like Rex. He discovered that aggression in animals was often a response to fear or insecurity. Rex's aggressive behavior hadn't been a direct reflection of Jake's failure. It had been an accumulation of trauma, misunderstood signals, and at times, instinctual fear. Jake began to see Rex's actions in a new light. It wasn't just about misbehaving. It was about pain, about a history of neglect that Jake could never fully undo. Understanding this didn't make the situation any less heartbreaking, but it gave Jake clarity. He was no longer blaming himself for Rex's actions. As he continued to learn, Jake slowly started forgiving himself. He could no longer undo the past, but he could learn from it, grow from it, and use it as a stepping stone toward personal healing. Every therapy session, every book he read, every lesson he absorbed helped him find peace with the choices he had made. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the guilt returned, but with time, Jake started to rebuild his sense of self. He couldn't change what had happened, but he could honor the love he had for Rex by making better choices in the future and learning to forgive himself. Have you ever felt like a chapter in your life was closing, but another one was waiting to begin, offering the hope of a fresh start? That's what Jake experienced after months of emotional turmoil, regret, and self-reflection. Through the lessons learned from his time with Rex, and after working through the guilt and pain, Jake was finally ready to take the next step. He wasn't sure if he could ever fully heal, but he was determined to try. So, after a long journey of understanding, learning, and self-forgiveness, Jake made a decision that would forever change his life. He adopted another dog. But this time, everything was different. Jake wasn't the same person who had first brought Rex into his home, blinded by hope and optimism alone. He was more cautious, more prepared, having learned the complexities of dog behavior and the weight of responsibility that came with owning an animal. The lessons from Rex, painful as they were, had shaped him into a more mindful and aware owner. He knew now that love wasn't just about affection, it was about setting boundaries, understanding needs, and recognizing when to step in and when to give space. As Jake met his new companion, a rescue dog with a gentle temperament and a cautious demeanor, something shifted. He felt a connection immediately, but it wasn't the same naive bond he had once hoped for with Rex. This time, Jake was tempered by the wisdom of experience. He could see the dog's nervousness, the remnants of past trauma that mirrored his own journey. And as their bond began to form, Jake took it slow. He was patient, steady, always making sure to build trust step by step, knowing that this new relationship would be built on the foundation of responsibility and mutual respect. Though Jake would never forget Rex, the pain of that loss gradually faded, replaced by the warmth of a new beginning. He found solace in the new bond, understanding that love and trust were earned, not given freely without careful consideration. The lessons he had learned through his time with Rex, the understanding of aggression, the importance of patience, and the depth of responsibility, now shaped his approach to this new chapter. Jake had finally realized that love, trust, and responsibility were not just words. They were the core principles of any healthy relationship. And as he moved forward with his new dog, he knew he was ready to face whatever came next, armed with the wisdom of the past and the hope for a brighter future.